Some chains are meant to hold animals. Others are meant to bury the truth. Dawn arrived quietly over the rolling hills outside Blackwater, Montana, where the last breath of autumn drifted across abandoned pastures in ribbons of pale fog. Frost clung to weathered fence posts, and the scent of pine mixed with damp earth as sunlight struggled to reach the forgotten corners of a property no one had touched in years. Former U.S. Marine Nathan Walker guided his aging pickup truck along a narrow dirt road, its tires crunching over loose gravel until a faded "No trespassing" sign leaned into view like a warning no one believed anymore. Nathan was 36, broad-shouldered and steady, with close-cropped brown hair beginning to gray at the temples and hazel eyes that carried the quiet weight of too many difficult memories. Since leaving the Marine Corps 2 years earlier, he had spent his days repairing old barns, clearing abandoned land, and taking whatever honest work small towns could offer. The routine kept his hands busy, even when his heart refused to be. That morning's assignment seemed simple enough. A local bank had hired him to inspect a neglected ranch before it went to auction. Most people said the place had nothing left worth saving. Nathan expected little more than broken fences and collapsing sheds. Instead, before he even shut off the engine, he heard it. A single bark. Low. Hoarse. Almost too tired to exist. He stepped from the truck and stood perfectly still. The sound came again, carried gently through the cold air. Not angry. Not frightened. Waiting. He followed it across waist-high grass, sparkling with frost, until an enormous cottonwood tree emerged through the mist. Beneath its twisted branches stood a German shepherd. The dog's sable coat was dull beneath layers of dust, his amber eyes calm despite the heavy chain fastened around his neck. Rust coated every link, disappearing into an iron stake driven deep into the ground. The animal neither growled nor retreated. He simply watched Nathan with the exhausted patience of someone who had waited far longer than anyone should. Nathan slowly removed his gloves and crouched several feet away. "Easy, buddy," he whispered. "I'm not here to make today any harder." The shepherd tilted his head ever so slightly, as though weighing every word. Then his tail moved once. Just once. Nathan's chest tightened. He had seen that look before, years ago, from frightened civilians and fellow Marines who no longer expected rescue, but still hoped for it anyway. He approached carefully, noticing how strangely quiet the property had become. No birds sang. No cattle wandered nearby. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the place. Kneeling beside the iron stake, Nathan ran his fingers across the weathered chain. It had been there for years, maybe decades. The padlock had surrendered to rust long ago. A single strike from the bolt cutters inside his truck snapped the chain apart with a dull metallic crack that echoed across the empty pasture. The German shepherd did not run. He did not bark. Instead, he stepped forward only 3 feet before stopping completely. Then he turned around. Slowly, deliberately. His gaze settled on the patch of earth where the stake had stood. He lowered his nose and pawed the frozen ground once. Then again. Nathan frowned. "What is it?" The dog looked back at him, his amber eyes unusually clear, almost pleading. Nathan fetched a shovel from the truck, more curious than convinced. The soil was harder than concrete beneath the frost, and each strike sent a hollow vibration through the handle. After several minutes, the blade struck something that wasn't rock. A sharp metallic sound rang through the silent pasture. Nathan knelt, brushing away dirt with trembling fingers until the corner of a small iron box emerged from beneath the earth. It was wrapped in roots so old they had grown around it like protective hands. The German shepherd sat quietly beside him, never taking his eyes off the hidden box. And for the first time since arriving at the abandoned ranch, Nathan realized the chain had never been there to keep the dog from escaping. It had been there to keep someone from finding what had waited beneath it for decades. Nathan carefully lifted the iron box from the frozen ground, surprised by how heavy it felt for something no larger than an old lunch pail. The metal was scarred by time, its corners softened by decades beneath the earth, while thick roots clung stubbornly to its sides, as though nature itself had tried to keep its secret hidden. The German shepherd remained seated beside the empty hole, his ears alert, his breathing calm, watching every movement Nathan made with quiet certainty instead of curiosity. It was not the expression of a dog discovering something new. It was the expression of one who had been waiting for someone else to discover it. Nathan carried the box to the tailgate of his truck, brushed away loose dirt with an old shop rag, and examined the rusted latch. There was no lock anymore. Time had already broken whatever once sealed it. With careful hands, he eased the lid upward. The hinges groaned softly, releasing the faint scent of aged paper, damp cedar, and iron. Inside rested three objects, each wrapped in yellowed canvas that had somehow survived the passing years. The first was a tarnished United States Marine Corps service badge, its eagle, globe, and anchor barely visible beneath the corrosion. Nathan instinctively straightened his posture. Even weathered beyond recognition, the emblem still carried a quiet dignity that every Marine understood without explanation. Beneath it lay a silver pocket watch, its cracked crystal frozen at exactly 7:16. Nathan gently turned the winding crown, but the hands refused to move. Whatever had happened, time itself had stopped inside that watch. The final bundle drew his attention immediately. It was a leather journal, its cover faded almost white, tied shut with brittle cord. He loosened the knot with deliberate care. On the first page, written in dark blue ink that had faded but remained legible, were 6 simple words. Property of Staff Sergeant Samuel Bennett, United States Marine Corps. Nathan stared at the name. It stirred no memory, yet something about it felt strangely familiar. He turned another page. The handwriting was steady and disciplined, the kind learned long before computers replaced notebooks. The first entries described ordinary things: weather, fence repairs, conversations with neighbors, the rebuilding of a family ranch after military service. Then, almost without warning, the tone shifted. Samuel wrote that people had begun asking unusual questions about land boundaries. Men he did not recognize appeared near the property after sunset. Someone had offered to buy the ranch for far more than it was worth, but refused to explain why. Nathan continued reading until a gust of cold wind flipped several pages at once. One sentence caught his eye immediately. If anything happens to me, the truth is beneath the old cottonwood. Do not trust the men who smile too easily. Nathan slowly looked toward the enormous tree standing alone across the pasture. The hole where the box had rested now appeared strangely insignificant beneath its sprawling roots. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always came before difficult decisions, the same quiet instinct that had carried him through countless patrols overseas. Some discoveries asked to be forgotten. Others demanded to be finished. Ranger suddenly rose to his feet. His ears lifted toward the northern edge of the property, where a weather-beaten farmhouse overlooked the field from nearly 200 yards away. Every window reflected the pale morning sun except one. Nathan narrowed his eyes. For the briefest moment, he could have sworn someone had been standing behind the upstairs glass, watching them. When he looked again, the window was empty. Ranger let out a single low whine, then stepped closer to Nathan until his shoulder rested gently against the former Marine's leg. Nathan closed the journal and glanced once more toward the silent house. Whatever had been buried beneath that tree for decades was no longer hidden. And somewhere beyond the frost-covered pasture, someone else had just realized it had been found. The upstairs window remained empty, yet Nathan could not shake the feeling that unseen eyes had measured every second since the iron box left the ground. Years in the Marine Corps had taught him to trust the quiet warnings that arrived before facts ever did. Ranger stood perfectly still beside the truck, his amber eyes fixed on the old farmhouse instead of the open field behind them. There was no growl, no bark, only patient attention, as though he recognized the place and expected it to reveal something more. Nathan slipped Samuel Bennett's journal into his canvas backpack, wrapped the Marine badge and silver watch in the shop rag once again, and closed the iron box before walking slowly toward the weathered house. Every wooden step leading to the porch answered with a tired creak beneath his boots. The front door hung slightly open, moving an inch with every gentle breath of wind. Dust floated through narrow beams of morning sunlight that spilled across faded floorboards scarred by countless years of use. The air smelled of dry cedar, old books, and memories that had never truly left. Ranger entered first without hesitation, his paws making almost no sound as he crossed the silent living room. Nathan noticed framed photographs lining a crooked mantel above a stone fireplace. Most had faded beyond recognition, but one still held enough color to tell its story. A younger Samuel Bennett stood smiling in a marine dress uniform beside a woman wearing a pale blue dress. Between them stood a little girl no older than 6, clutching the leash of a German Shepherd puppy with oversized ears and bright, curious eyes. Nathan looked from the photograph to Ranger. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. The markings around the eyes, the shape of the muzzle, the proud posture. Ranger could not possibly be that puppy after so many years. Yet something about the bloodline felt unmistakable, as though loyalty itself had been passed from one generation to the next. Ranger suddenly turned away from the fireplace and padded down a narrow hallway. Nathan followed until the dog stopped outside a small study. Shelves filled with dusty books covered one wall, while an oak desk faced a window overlooking the cottonwood tree in the distance. The chair had been pushed back slightly, as though someone had stood up in the middle of a conversation and never returned. Nathan carefully opened the desk drawer. Inside rested neatly stacked envelopes tied together with faded twine. Every envelope carried the same return address: Blackwater County Records Office. None had ever been opened. Beneath them lay an old county map with several parcels outlined in red pencil. One section circled the Bennett Ranch. Another circled neighboring land now marked only by a handwritten question mark. Nathan unfolded the map completely. Along its bottom edge, Samuel had written a single sentence: "They are not buying the land. They are buying what lies beneath it." Nathan frowned. The words echoed differently than the journal entries. This was no longer a worried rancher recording strange events. This was a man who had reached a conclusion. Before Nathan could study the map further, Ranger walked to the far corner of the room and placed one paw against a tall wooden bookcase. He did not scratch or bark. He simply waited. Nathan approached and rested both hands against the shelf. It shifted slightly beneath gentle pressure. Hidden behind decades of dust, the floor revealed faint scrape marks that should not have existed if the bookcase had always remained in place. He exchanged a long glance with Ranger, whose calm expression never changed. With slow determination, Nathan began pushing the heavy bookcase aside, revealing a narrow opening concealed within the wall, where complete darkness had been waiting in absolute silence for longer than anyone in Blackwater seemed willing to remember. The opening behind the bookcase was barely wide enough for one person to enter, its rough wooden frame hidden so perfectly that even a careful visitor would have walked past it 100 times without noticing. Nathan switched on the small flashlight he kept inside his backpack and swept its beam into the darkness. A narrow staircase descended beneath the house, each worn step covered by a thin blanket of dust untouched for years. The air below was cool and carried the earthy scent of stone, old timber, and forgotten seasons. Ranger stepped onto the first stair without hesitation, then paused to glance back at Nathan, waiting until the former Marine followed. Together they disappeared beneath the quiet farmhouse while the morning sunlight faded behind them. At the bottom of the staircase lay a small underground room built from stacked river stones. Shelves lined the walls, holding empty glass jars, rusted tools, and wooden crates that had long since surrendered to age. Nothing suggested hidden treasure or riches. Instead, the room felt like a place created to protect memories from disappearing. Nathan slowly circled the space until his flashlight settled on a large oak cabinet standing alone against the far wall. Unlike everything else below ground, the cabinet showed almost no signs of decay. Someone had cared enough to preserve it. He opened its doors carefully. Inside rested dozens of neatly organized folders wrapped in oilcloth, each labeled by year in Samuel Bennett's careful handwriting. Ranch surveys, property records, letters, tax documents, maps. Every file had been arranged with remarkable precision. Nathan selected the oldest folder and unfolded a survey map dated 34 years earlier. At first glance, it looked identical to the county map upstairs. Then he noticed the difference. A natural spring appeared near the northern ridge of the Bennett property, yet that same spring had completely vanished from every modern record he had seen. He reached for another folder. This one contained handwritten correspondence between Samuel and several county officials requesting clarification about sudden changes to legal boundaries. None of the replies answered his questions directly. Most simply informed him that updated records had replaced the originals. Nathan's jaw tightened. Administrative mistakes happened. Entire collections of mistakes rarely pointed in the same direction. Ranger quietly crossed the room until he stopped beside a low wooden chest tucked beneath the cabinet. He lowered his nose and nudged the lid once. Nathan knelt beside him and lifted it open. Folded neatly inside rested an American flag protected inside clear plastic, several family photographs, and a small velvet pouch. Within the pouch lay a simple brass key attached to a weathered leather tag. Across the tag, faded but still readable, were 3 words burned into the leather years ago. Mill Creek Depot. Nathan searched the room again, hoping another clue might explain why an old railroad depot mattered. Instead, he discovered a single envelope resting beneath the chest, addressed only with the words, "For the one who finally listens to the dog." He unfolded the letter carefully. Samuel's handwriting filled only half the page. "If you are reading this, then he trusted you. Follow where he leads. Do not follow the people. The land remembers everything, even when records do not." Nathan read the sentence twice before folding the letter back into his pocket. Ranger had already turned toward the staircase, his ears suddenly raised. A distant sound drifted through the floor above them. It was faint but unmistakable. Tires rolled slowly across loose gravel outside the farmhouse. Another vehicle had just arrived at the abandoned ranch. Nathan extinguished his flashlight at once. In the sudden darkness, Ranger remained perfectly calm, listening without fear. Whoever had come this morning had not expected anyone to uncover the room beneath the house. And judging by the careful pace of the footsteps now crossing the porch overhead, they were determined to find out exactly who had. The footsteps above moved slowly across the old floorboards, never hurried, never uncertain, as though the visitor had walked through the farmhouse many times before. Nathan remained perfectly still beneath the staircase, one hand resting on the canvas backpack that now held Samuel Bennett's journal, while the other gently touched Ranger's shoulder. The German shepherd did not flinch. His ears followed every faint sound drifting through the ceiling, yet his breathing remained calm. After nearly a minute, a door opened somewhere above them, followed by the scrape of furniture sliding across worn wood. Then silence returned. Nathan waited another full minute before switching on his flashlight again. Years in uniform had taught him that patience often revealed more than speed ever could. He carefully closed the hidden cabinet, returned every folder exactly where he had found it, and slipped the brass key marked Mill Creek Depot into his jacket pocket. Whatever those documents contained, they deserved to remain protected until he understood the entire story. Ranger quietly climbed the narrow staircase first. Nathan followed a few steps behind, listening for any movement beyond the concealed doorway. The house felt different now. The air seemed heavier, carrying the faint smell of fresh coffee instead of abandoned dust. Someone had been inside only moments earlier. Nathan slowly pushed the bookcase back into place until the hidden entrance disappeared once more. When he stepped into the study, nothing appeared disturbed except for a single business card resting neatly in the center of Samuel's desk. It had not been there before. Nathan picked it up. Thick ivory paper, dark blue lettering. Thomas Whitmore. Whitmore Land and Development. On the back, written in careful black ink, was a short message. "We should talk before this becomes complicated." Nathan stared at the words without speaking. There was no phone number beyond the printed office line. No threat. No explanation. Only confidence. The kind of confidence carried by someone accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Ranger walked to the front window overlooking the pasture. Outside, a spotless black sport utility vehicle rolled away from the ranch, disappearing beyond the tree line without raising much dust. Nathan memorized the license plate anyway, repeating the numbers quietly to himself until they settled into memory. He slipped the card into his pocket beside the brass key. Neither object felt accidental anymore. One pointed toward the past. The other had arrived from the present. Before leaving the farmhouse, Nathan returned to the faded family photograph above the fireplace. He studied Samuel Bennett's smile, the little girl holding the German shepherd puppy, and the peaceful confidence captured forever inside that single frame. Whatever had happened here had not begun with greed. It had begun with an ordinary family building an honest life. Somewhere along the way, someone had decided that life stood in the path of something more valuable than a home. Outside, the morning had grown brighter. Sunlight spilled across the frost-covered field, turning every blade of grass into tiny pieces of silver. Ranger stepped from the porch, paused for only a heartbeat, then looked north instead of toward Nathan's truck. His nose lifted into the cold breeze before he began walking across the pasture with quiet determination. Nathan followed without hesitation. Nearly 300 yards beyond the cottonwood tree, where the land gently rose toward the foothills, the remains of an old railroad line cut through the valley like a forgotten scar. Ranger stopped beside the rusted tracks and waited. Nathan looked down the empty rails stretching toward the distant mountains, then reached into his pocket and wrapped his fingers around the small brass key. The faded leather tag suddenly felt far less mysterious. Mill Creek Depot was not simply another clue. It was the next destination Samuel Bennett had chosen decades earlier, trusting that one day the right person, guided by the right dog, would continue the journey he had never been allowed to finish. By late afternoon, the mountains cast long blue shadows across the valley, and the abandoned railroad tracks seemed to disappear into a silence that belonged to another century. Nathan drove slowly along the uneven service road until a weathered wooden sign appeared through the pines. Mill Creek Depot. The faded letters were barely readable beneath years of wind and snow, yet the place itself still stood with quiet dignity. The small depot leaned slightly to one side, its red paint almost completely washed away, while broken windows reflected nothing except the empty tracks stretching toward the horizon. Ranger stepped from the truck before Nathan had even reached for the door handle. His nose caught the cold mountain air, and he began walking toward the station with calm confidence instead of excitement. It was the same deliberate pace he had shown beneath the cottonwood tree, as though every destination had already been chosen long before Nathan entered his life. The old wooden platform groaned beneath their weight. Dust drifted lazily through narrow shafts of sunlight shining between loose roof boards, and somewhere inside the building an old wind chime answered each passing breeze with a soft metallic note. Nathan removed the brass key from his pocket and looked around the deserted station. There was no obvious lock waiting for it. Only cracked benches, abandoned luggage carts, and faded travel posters from another generation remained. Ranger continued deeper inside until he stopped beside an enormous oak freight cabinet built into the back wall. The cabinet looked ordinary except for one detail. Unlike everything surrounding it, its brass lock showed almost no rust. Nathan inserted the key. It turned smoothly with a quiet click that sounded impossibly clear inside the empty depot. The cabinet door slowly opened, revealing not money, jewelry, or hidden valuables, but dozens of carefully stacked survey tubes tied with blue ribbon alongside leather binders protected inside waxed canvas. Nathan removed the first tube and gently unrolled an oversized engineering map across the cabinet shelf. His eyes widened almost immediately. The map revealed an underground aquifer stretching beneath several thousand acres surrounding Blackwater, including the Bennett Ranch and neighboring properties. Detailed notes described an unusually pure water source capable of supplying nearby communities for generations. Attached to the corner of the map was a newer document prepared years later by a private development company. The natural spring had vanished from the revised version, replaced by blank acreage carrying almost no declared value. Nathan understood at once why Samuel had written that people were not buying the land. They had been trying to erase the reason the land mattered. Ranger quietly sat beside him while Nathan examined additional binders containing appraisal reports, correspondence, and signed statements from surveyors questioning why official county records no longer matched their original findings. Every page pointed toward the same unsettling conclusion. The truth had not disappeared by accident. It had been rewritten one document at a time until almost nobody remembered what the land once held. As Nathan carefully returned the papers to their protective sleeves, a small envelope slipped from between two binders and landed gently on the wooden floor. Across its front, Samuel Bennett had written only one sentence. There will be one honest person left. Trust that person before you trust any office. Nathan folded the note into his pocket, wondering who Samuel had believed would still stand for the truth after so many years. Before he could think any further, Ranger suddenly lifted his head toward the depot entrance. Outside, another vehicle rolled slowly to a stop on the gravel road. This time the engine did not shut off. It simply waited, as though whoever sat behind the steering wheel already knew exactly where Nathan had gone and was willing to be patient until he stepped back into the fading evening light. The engine outside continued its steady idle, blending with the whisper of pine trees beyond the depot until the two sounds became almost indistinguishable. Nathan remained still for several seconds, allowing silence to tell him what impatience never could. Whoever had followed him wanted him to know they were there. That alone meant they were relying more on pressure than certainty. Ranger stood beside the open cabinet, his amber eyes fixed toward the entrance, his posture relaxed but attentive. Nathan carefully returned every survey tube and leather binder exactly as he had found them, closed the cabinet, and slipped the brass key back into his jacket pocket. Samuel Bennett had protected these records for more than 3 decades. Nathan intended to honor that trust. Together they stepped onto the weathered platform where the evening sun painted the old railroad tracks in soft shades of gold. Waiting beside a dark blue pickup truck stood a gray-haired man wearing a heavy canvas coat and a worn felt hat. He looked to be in his early 70s, his shoulders slightly bent with age but his eyes remarkably clear. He did not approach. He simply removed his hat in a quiet gesture of respect. "Nathan Walker?" he asked. Nathan nodded without taking another step. The older man offered a faint smile that carried more sadness than comfort. "My name is Walter Hayes. I was hoping Samuel's letter would find the right person someday." Nathan felt his attention sharpen immediately. "You knew him?" Walter glanced toward Ranger before answering. "I knew his family. I also knew enough to stay alive by keeping my mouth shut. That is something I have regretted almost every day since." Ranger slowly walked toward Walter and stopped within a few feet of him. The old man lowered one weathered hand. The German shepherd sniffed his fingers for only a moment before gently leaning his head against Walter's leg. The old surveyor closed his eyes, and Nathan noticed the corners of them glisten in the fading light. "He has the same eyes," Walter whispered. "Just like the shepherd Samuel's little girl used to bring into my office every summer." Nathan listened without interrupting. Walter reached into the inside pocket of his coat and carefully removed a folded envelope sealed inside clear plastic. "I promised myself that if anyone ever found Samuel's evidence, I would finally hand this over." Nathan accepted the envelope. Inside rested an official survey certification bearing Walter's signature and the signatures of 3 other licensed surveyors. Attached behind it were copies of original county maps proving that the underground spring had once been legally documented before every public record was quietly altered. Walter sighed deeply before speaking again. The county never corrected a mistake. They erased the truth. Powerful investors wanted control of the water beneath these valleys. Samuel refused to sell because he believed the spring belonged to every family that depended on it. After that, people stopped listening to him. Then they stopped talking about him altogether. Nathan looked across the quiet mountains where the last sunlight settled over the pine forests. Everything suddenly fit together. The disappearing land records, the hidden maps, the pressure to purchase worthless ranches. Even the abandoned depot had become nothing more than a vault protecting evidence that should never have needed hiding. "Why now?" Nathan finally asked. Walter smiled gently. "Because men my age eventually realize that peace does not come from keeping secrets. It comes from telling the truth while there is still time." Before Nathan could respond, another vehicle appeared at the far end of the gravel road. This one did not slow as cautiously as the first. Instead, it stopped several yards away before its headlights quietly switched off. The driver's door opened, and a tall man in an expensive wool coat stepped into the evening air with measured confidence. Nathan recognized the face immediately from the business card resting inside his pocket. Thomas Whitmore. The developer looked first at Nathan, then at Walter, and finally at Ranger. His expression never hardened, yet the warmth disappeared from his smile. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "I believe you have been looking through things that no longer belong to the past." Ranger stepped forward until he stood shoulder to shoulder with Nathan, his gaze never leaving the newcomer, while the last light of day faded across the forgotten railroad tracks, and the truth Samuel Bennett had protected for decades stood closer than ever to being heard. Thomas Whitmore stopped several feet away, leaving enough distance to appear courteous while making it clear he intended to control the conversation. His polished shoes stood in sharp contrast to the gravel beneath them, and the expensive wool coat he wore seemed strangely out of place against the weathered depot and the fading Montana sunset. He folded his hands calmly and offered Nathan the same measured smile that had appeared on the business card left inside the farmhouse. "You have found remarkable pieces of local history," he said in an even voice. "History deserves respect. It also deserves the right hands." Nathan met his gaze without answering. Ranger remained beside him, silent and watchful, his ears forward but his posture relaxed. Walter Hayes slowly placed his hat back on his head, his weathered face revealing neither fear nor anger, only quiet resolve. Thomas looked toward the old surveyor. "Walter, you have carried unnecessary burdens for many years. There is still an opportunity to leave the past where it belongs." Walter smiled faintly. "The past has never stayed where you wanted it. That has always been your problem." For the first time, Thomas allowed a trace of disappointment to cross his face. He reached into his coat and removed a neatly prepared folder. "The county is prepared to purchase every remaining parcel connected to the old Bennett property. The owners will receive generous compensation. The community will benefit from future development. Everyone wins." Nathan accepted the folder without opening it. Instead, he looked beyond Thomas toward the valley stretching beneath the evening sky. The wind carried the scent of pine and cold water, and suddenly Samuel Bennett's words returned with perfect clarity. "They are not buying the land. They are buying what lies beneath it." Nathan handed the folder back. Some things were never meant to be sold. Thomas remained silent for several seconds before quietly nodding. "I was hoping you would be practical." "I am," Nathan replied. "Practical enough to know the difference between property and truth." Ranger gently stepped forward, not as a threat, but as though placing himself between two different futures. Thomas noticed the movement and studied the German shepherd for a long moment. "Interesting," he said softly. "That dog has changed everything." Walter reached into his coat once more and removed his cellular telephone. "Actually," he said with surprising calm, "he changed everything yesterday." Nathan looked toward him with quiet curiosity. Walter smiled. "After I recognized Samuel's handwriting in the copies you showed me this afternoon, I contacted the Montana State Historical Preservation Office and the State Water Resources Division. I also sent certified copies of every original survey I kept hidden in my own barn for 31 years. They have already acknowledged receipt." Thomas's expression finally changed. It was not anger. It was the unmistakable realization that events had moved beyond his influence. Walter continued gently. "Original records carry dates. Certified surveys carry licenses. Once they reach the state archive, they cannot simply disappear." At that moment, two vehicles approached along the gravel road from the opposite direction. Neither carried flashing lights nor dramatic urgency. They simply arrived with quiet purpose. One belonged to the State Historical Preservation Office. The other bore the seal of the Montana Department of Natural Resources. Several officials stepped out carrying document cases instead of accusations. One introduced herself with a warm handshake before asking Nathan if he would be willing to explain how the evidence had been discovered. Nathan looked down at Ranger, whose tail moved slowly for the first time since leaving the cottonwood tree. The German shepherd gazed toward the distant mountains where the hidden spring flowed beneath the earth exactly as it had for generations, untouched by altered maps or forgotten records. In that peaceful moment, Nathan realized the greatest victory had never been exposing a secret. It was making certain the truth could finally belong to everyone again. 3 months later, spring arrived quietly in Blackwater, carrying the scent of fresh rain, wild grass, and pine across the same valley that had guarded its secret for decades. Snow had melted from the hillsides. The cottonwood tree stretched new green leaves toward a bright Montana sky, and the forgotten ranch no longer looked abandoned. Volunteers had repaired broken fences. The old farmhouse stood with freshly painted windows, and a simple wooden sign near the entrance now read, "Bennett Family Heritage Ranch." Visitors stopped there every weekend to learn the true history of the land and the family that had refused to surrender it. The underground spring had been officially protected by the state, ensuring that its waters would remain a public resource for generations to come. Nathan Walker returned one cool Saturday morning, driving the same aging pickup truck that had first carried him onto the property. Ranger sat beside him with his head resting comfortably near the open window, his sable coat now clean and healthy beneath the warm sunlight. The heavy rusted chain was gone forever, Around his neck rested a simple leather collar bearing a small brass tag engraved with only one word: Ranger. Nothing more was needed. As Nathan stepped from the truck, Walter Hayes greeted him with a warm handshake and a smile that seemed years younger than before. The old surveyor looked across the valley with quiet satisfaction. "Samuel would have liked this," he said softly. Nathan nodded. "I think he already does." Together they walked toward the cottonwood tree where everything had begun. The iron stake had been removed, but one small section of the weathered chain had been carefully mounted inside a glass display beside a bronze plaque. It did not celebrate suffering. It honored freedom. Beneath the chain were engraved the words Samuel Bennett had written so many years before. "The land remembers everything, even when records do not." Ranger approached the memorial slowly. He sat for a long moment before gently lowering his head, almost as though paying respect to memories carried not only by people, but somehow through generations of loyal hearts. Nathan rested one hand against the German shepherd's shoulder, feeling the steady warmth beneath his fingertips. He realized that if he had ignored a single tired bark on a quiet autumn morning, none of this would have happened. The truth might have remained hidden beneath frozen earth for another generation. A family would have remained forgotten. A promise would have remained unfinished. Instead, one simple act of kindness had uncovered far more than an old iron box. It had restored a name, protected a community, and given purpose back to a man who believed he had left his most meaningful days behind. Before leaving the ranch, Nathan unlocked the passenger door of his truck. Ranger climbed inside without needing a command, settling comfortably into the seat that had quietly become his own. Nathan looked once more toward the cottonwood tree standing proudly against the endless Montana sky. The morning breeze moved gently through its branches, carrying a sound that almost resembled distant laughter. Perhaps it was only the wind, or perhaps some promises never disappear. They simply wait for someone willing to hear them. Nathan started the engine and guided the truck onto the country road. Ranger looked ahead, calm and content, no longer leading Nathan toward hidden places because there were no secrets left to uncover. There was only open road, honest work, and the quiet certainty that the smallest act of mercy could echo across decades. As the ranch disappeared behind them, and the mountains welcomed another peaceful day, Nathan smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember, understanding that some chains are broken with strength, but the ones that truly change the world are broken with compassion.